A little bit, I'd like to start by reading something to you. Charles Sherrod was talking a great deal yesterday about what it meant to overcome fear and the struggle against fear. And of course, as he indicated, one of the major contributions that the SNCC workers made in all of those difficult, dangerous places where they operated was to try, sometimes like Charles, to hide the shaking of their knees, but most importantly, to say to people, we are not going to let this fear overcome us. We're going to keep going. What I want to read has to do with Charles and others and that kind of a setting. The atmosphere of confrontation and overcoming fear became most evident in the meeting in Sasser, a country town in Terrell County. On Monday night, July 25th, 1962, Sherrod, some of his interracial SNCC comrades, and several of the local black leaders and participants were carrying on their weekly voter registration meeting at Mount Olive Baptist Church. There were some 30 or 35 people in the building. Attendance was lower than usual, partly because of a threat from whites that the gathering would be broken up. But the meeting went on, likely encouraged by the presence of 3 national newspaper reporters who had also heard about the threat. The session began as usual, with a hymn, a prayer, and a Bible reading, the necessary ingredients for starting a meeting anywhere in the Black South. Sherrod was in charge of this part of the meeting. The anxiety level was higher than usual that night, but the SNCC organizer kept his voice even and calm as he opened the session. They sang, "Pass me not, O gentle Savior, hear my humble cry. While on others thou art calling, do not pass me by." And then they repeated the Lord's Prayer together. Sherrod led them in repeating the 23rd Psalm, slowing down on the words, "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil." Just then, they heard the sound of car doors slamming in the driveway. Sherrod had begun to read one of his favorite passages from the New Testament. When he heard the car doors, he said quietly, firmly, "They're standing just outside now. If they come in, I'm going to read this over again." He read from Romans 8:31. "If God be for us, who can be against us?" At that point, about 15 white men from Sasser walked in, including one in a sheriff deputy's uniform, along with Sheriff Matthews in plain clothes. They lined up against the wall in the back of the church while Sherrod completed the reading. Then, without missing a beat, the young freedom minister began to pray. "Into thy hand do we commend our minds and souls and our lives every day. We've been abused so long. We've been down so long." The amens and the of the people had begun to roll into place between his phrases, and they came again when Sherrod went on. "All we want," he said, "is for our white brothers to understand that thou who made us all, and in thy sight we are all one." Sheriff Matthews had bowed his head and closed his eyes. Sherrod continued, "We aren't praying for safety from the storms of life. We are praying for strength to go through the storms of life. And oh Lord, we pray for love, the love that allows us to stand up to our adversaries and love them despite the evil they do us. Again, there were many amens, but the white men against the back wall were silent. Sherrod led the strangely mixed congregation in the Lord's Prayer, and then someone began singing, "We are climbing Jacob's ladder." Soon after the song began, the men in the back filed out. At the end of the song, Sheriff Matthews, accompanied by two of his deputies and the sheriff of the neighboring Sumter County, walked back in. One deputy now had a large revolver holstered on his belt. The other one was brandishing a 2-foot-long flashlight, a familiar weapon. By this time, Lucius Holloway, the local chairman of the voter registration drive, had begun to lead the meeting, and he called out to the lawmen, "Everybody is welcome. This is the voter registration meeting." Sheriff Matthews responded, "We're a little fed up with this registering business. Niggers down here have been happy for 100 years, and now this has started. We want our colored people to live like they've always been living. There never was any trouble before all this started. It's caused great dislike between colored and white." Then the deputies began taking the names of everybody present, and they told the local black people that they did not need the outsiders from SNCC in order to register. They also issued ominous threats about what could happen to blacks after their outsider allies left the area. In the midst of the lawman's performance, someone began humming, "We Shall Overcome." Others picked up the song. The lawmen retreated to the back of the church, and the people continued their meeting, giving reports of registration attempts, testimonies of beatings, and statements of hope. At the end of the meeting, they gathered in a circle at the church door to sing, "We Are Not Afraid." That night there was no violence, except to the tires of one of the reporters' cars. But several nights later, the little church was burned to the ground. Eventually, most of the SNCC workers and community leaders who were at that meeting found themselves thrown in jail and beaten as usual. Still, the organizing and overcoming continued in Terrell County and elsewhere in the Deep South. In the course of our conversation yesterday, we heard Sherrod talk about his brother and sidekick, a few years younger than himself, Cordell Reagan. Partly because Cordell went on his way beyond this life not very long ago, I thought you might want to hear Cordell's voice leading one of the favorite songs of the movement, "Ain't Gonna Let Nobody Turn Me Round." By 1963, when this was recorded, he and the Freedom Singers had changed the mode a bit of the song, but the words were still the same. "Ain't gonna let nobody turn me round."
Ain't gonna let nobody alone turn me round, turn me round, no. Ain't gonna let nobody turn me round. I keep on walking, yeah, keep on freedom land. Ain't gonna let no city commissioner, Lord, turn me round, turn me round, turn me round. Ain't gonna let no city commissioner, Lord, turn me round and keep on walking, yeah, keep on talking, Lord, marching up to freedom land. Ain't gonna let segregation, oh Lord, turn me round, turn me round, turn me round. Ain't gonna let segregation, Lord, turn me round and keep on walking, yeah, keep on talking, Lord, marching up to freedom land. Let nobody, Lord, turn me round, turn me round, turn me round. Ain't gonna let nobody, Lord, turn me round. I keep on walking, yeah, keep on talking, Lord, marching up to freedom land.
Yeah. Ooh, yeah. Oh, yes. As some of you recognize, the strong woman voice that was meeting Cordell's voice in the song was the voice of Bernice Johnson at the time. And after a while, she became Bernice Johnson Reagan. This afternoon, we have a couple of folks who weren't with us last time. One of them you're going to hear a lot from tomorrow and Thursday. But everybody who wasn't here last time has to come into the ritual. And the ritual is, tell us your name as fully as you can. And the ritual is, tell us where you spent your childhood. And the ritual is, tell us what comes to your mind or your heart when you hear the words freedom movement or civil rights movement. Those three things bring you into the ritual. Your name, where you spent your childhood, and what comes to your mind or heart when you hear that term, freedom movement or civil rights movement. Why don't we start with you? Yes, you've got freedom on your body there.
This is it. Hi, I'm Nancy Good, and I grew up in Wisconsin. I haven't been back there for many, many years. But I think the civil rights movement or the freedom movement reminds me more of Washington, D.C., where we lived. A little bit of Denver, too. We've lived in integrated neighborhoods and worked very hard to keep them integrated and to, particularly in my case, working on schools. And we spent 4 years in Africa in a newly independent country right after independence. So all these sort of are related to one another.
Good. And your first name is Virginia, is it?
Oh, did you?
Is your first name Virginia, is it?
Nancy.
Nancy Good. Okay. The mic comes down here to the lady in the green.
My name is Prathia Laura Ann Hall. I spent my childhood in Philadelphia, and there's such a kind of gushing stream of things that come to my mind when I hear the word freedom. One of them is struggle. And another is aspiration and destination.
Thank you, Sister Prathia. Very glad that you made it.
Thank you.
Okay. It's okay. Don't worry, Rachel. We appreciate your energy and your enthusiasm. We'll find some more people for you one of these days. Yesterday, Charles was talking to us about his early days, his childhood, the little church that he created for himself as a child, his belief that he was going to somehow or another be a preacher, or on a deeper level, be a servant of God in the world. As is often helpful, I'd like to ask those of you, especially at the table here, who were here yesterday, to reflect on what stays with you from yesterday, what stands out for you from Charles's sharing with us from yesterday. Would one of you share with us to help bring others in on the scene? Susan?
Well, I shared this with Charles after class. He said he was terrible with dates, and he remembered a very special date, the 22nd of February, 1961, and I said that was my birthday.
All right.
I turned 16 on that day, and so I felt that was significant for me as well as for him.
Good, thank you. Happy birthday to you, a little delayed. What else? Who else? Gina? Wait a second, get the
Well, I was talking to someone about what I thought of you, and I said, well, I really admire the fact that you're so humble, you know, to be able to admit, oh, well, I forgot, or I forget this and that and the other thing, and, you know, and I love how passionate you are and determined and a lot of other things.
Good.
But that's where I'll go.
Good. The passion comes through. Anybody else? Anything from last time? Yes, Carter.
Okay. Well, I'd like to ditto the passion thing too. I thought about that a lot. That you had mentioned that you were 60 years old, and I thought, you know, you've got more life than than most 30-year-old people that I know, and I think that's a real great attribute. I have been thinking since yesterday about a couple of things that you had said. You had talked a little bit about your theology or your worldview being that this is not your world, that your world is the spiritual, transcendent world of God. And I guess I've been thinking that, generally speaking, the people that I have studied or have known to have that similar worldview have been people that were content with the status quo, or they were people that believed the status quo could not be changed. And they, you know, many oppressed people, things like that. And yet you have dedicated your life to changing the status quo. You are willing to give up your life to change this finite world. And I wondered if you could reflect a little bit on that. I think somewhat of a paradox. You know, did that worldview of the sort of infinite world make it easier for you to be willing to give up your life? Or?
Carter, could I ask you to hold that until we've gotten into a little bit more of that life?
Sure.
And then bring that question back?
That's fine.
It's a very powerful and very important one. I was hoping somebody would catch that interesting connection of Charles's ideas there. So thank you for that, and do not let us get out of here without pressing that back, okay? Anybody else have anything on your mind from yesterday? Malika.
One thing that struck me also.
Wait.
One thing that struck me also was your ability to admit that you did lose your temper, even though you lost it once. I remember growing up as a child. Part of my childhood was spent in Atlanta, and my father is from Hancock County, Georgia, which is south of Atlanta. And the one question I always asked was, how were you always nonviolent? I didn't understand it. When I got into by the time I got into high school, we had seemingly gone all over the world and come back, the country, and come back to Atlanta. And I had a teacher who was in the movement in Albany when she was 16. And that was a question that I asked her, how is it that you were always nonviolent? And she said, well, we just learned how not to lose our temper. And it's important for me to realize that you were still human enough to lose your temper, even though you quickly regained your perspective and were able to continue in a nonviolent fashion.
Good. Thank you. Anyone else? Risa, you taking that to speak?
Yeah.
Okay.
Mine wasn't a comment so much as it was a question. You talked about how it was important to keep God as a center for like the spirituality and that sort of thing. And just thinking about the civil rights movement, it seemed that there was a lot more passion at that time on both sides. You know, if you were fighting for the black people or against it or whatever. Nowadays, I come from a generation of people who have completely, missed the point. We have no idea of what it means to be spiritual. We don't have that center as a whole, people being, 22 and younger. What do you do to motivate someone, my age or, more importantly, even the younger kids to have that passion and to find that strength within themselves? Because it seems like we're so apathetic right now that we're almost materialistic also, that we find our strength and our passion in material things and outside things as opposed to in God. What do you say to us?
Well, obviously with such passion, we can't keep holding off these questions. So, Charles, why don't you at least take that one, and then we'll see if we can bring in some of the other ones after we get you to talk to the autobiography some more. Why don't you pick up Risa's question if you feel inclined to do that?
Risa's question is a question of our generation. It's a question of our world, the whole civilization. It's a question of whether we live in fear of God, if we live with God, if we live carrying our actions, doing things with the understanding that we do that under the grace, under the power of God, or we take the position that all that I am, all that I have ever been, all that I will be is because of me. See, the greatest evil, and in my business, the greatest sin, the greatest evil in the world is selfishness. It's pride. And some of us, I talked about my ego yesterday, some of us have, our heads are so big, they cannot enter the room. We think about ourselves so much that we cannot hear anything anybody else says to us. And what we do, we make ourselves gods. We are the God. It does not matter what happens to you. It's what happens to me. It does not matter. Life does not exist without me. And the longer we have that kind of force, that kind of feeling, that kind of emotion, that kind of attitude toward people and things. Now that's the attitude we are taught in our country. That's how we can kill millions of people all over the world and say that we are doing it to keep the world safe for democracy and for goodness. We are the good guys. They are the bad guys. What do we do about this? I mean, how do you approach a person? How can you communicate with a person who has no feelings for anything but himself or herself? I say all you can do is to be true to yourself. If you're around that person, then you act like you think you ought to act. You act loving. You're sensitive to other people's needs. You walk that walk and you talk that talk to the best of your ability, based on what you believe. If you're a minister, you preach a sermon. If you're a teacher, you teach a course. But you talk about it. You teach that course in love. And you teach athletics. You teach that running and that football playing and all of that. You do that in love. Whatever you do, wherever you are, you can open yourself to the other person. Spend a little time with this person. Spend a little time with that person. Be tolerant of another person's view. But if you're in my business and somebody asks me, Sherrod, why do you get so much faith? How is it that you can let them folk beat you up? How is it that you can let... I said, I believe that I am God's. That whatever I do, whatever I feel, all the accomplishments of my life belong to Him. So there ain't nothing nobody can do to me. You can't hurt me. You call me a name, smack me upside the head. I might hit you back. Do whatever, say whatever to me. And I say to you that I love you. I appreciate myself. I respect myself. I love myself. But I don't take myself too serious. And I love you. I can be serious with you. I can listen to you. I think you are an important person on this world. I think that you've got something to do that nobody else in this world can do but you. But you got to find it for yourself. I wish I could show you the way, but I got this load of 60 years on me. But I'd help you find a way if I was close to you.
All right. Wait, Malika, okay? Charles, you are irresistible. But Sadosh and I want to take you a little bit further more into that history of yours before we come out into the questions again.